Okay, so I just wanted to say welcome everyone to the continuation of our lecture series surrounding the Design for BioCities contest, which is the 9th iteration of the Advanced Architecture Contest run by IAAC. This year, we asked the question of how to design cities which are ecologically attuned. Our speakers for this series continue to question ecology in relation to architecture and urbanism. To note quickly, the deadline for the submissions is June 1st, so feel free to check out the website, which I'll drop in the chat later. I'm very pleased tonight to be joined by Michiel van Iersel, whose work I somewhat unconsciously had been following for some time through failed architecture, but thought I found it through his project Archipocene, which explores the ecological and geological impact of architecture in the construction industry, looking for alternatives. Michiel is an independent urbanist, curator, writer, and teacher, and holds the position of program lead of the New Europe Chair of Architecture and Urban Transformation at ETH Zurich. He works at the intersection of the arts, architecture, urban design, and heritage. He is the co-founder of Nonfiction, a collective of people with a common interest in public values and cultural production, collaboratively making exhibitions and publications, conducting research, reactivating spaces, and organizing events with the aim of bringing people and ideas closer together. Nonfiction has curated exhibitions and public programs for the Stedelijk Museum Amsterdam, the NIVA Institute, and Museum de Halle in Haarlem. In addition, Michiel co-founded the ongoing research project Failed Architecture, dedicated to exploring the causes, perceptions, and representations of architectural and urban failures. This publication challenges dominant spatial fashions and explores alternative realities, reaching far beyond the architectural community, combining personal stories with research and reflection, while always remaining committed to the idea that architecture is about social justice and climate justice, pop culture and subculture, representation and imagination, and everything that happens after the building has been built. Michiel is also a tutor at the Gerrit Rietveld Academy and the Academy of Architecture in Amsterdam. And he was curator of the 2016 International Architecture Biennial Rotterdam. So I guess with that, Michiel, welcome. You can go ahead and kind of start your presentation.
Well, thank you, Kaya, for this wonderful and very complete introduction. I hope I can live up to the expectation that all these amazing words raise. But thank you also to IAAC for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to be part of this ongoing series of lectures or conversations. So I looked at the previous speaker, so I will try to respond to some of the things that they might have said, even though I didn't watch the videos, but I know their work or I read a bit around it. But I also just want to share some of my fascinations and observations of the past few years. So I really see this as an open conversation, so I hope to have a chance also to hear from some of you. But let me start with showing some slides and maybe also showing you some of my own work. Yeah, let me share my screen. And let me start with this image of this, what I think is a very fascinating part of the world, which was just recently opened. Maybe some of you have seen it or been there. Maybe some of you are actually in New York now, and maybe you can verify or falsify what I'm about to say. This is Little Island, just off Manhattan, Pier 55, I think. And I will talk about it more in detail later, but this is one of the things that has captured my attention in recent months and years, and it raises all kinds of questions to me. So what are these trees doing there? What kind of landscape is this? What are the intentions behind it? What is the value of it? What is the duration of such a project? What are the costs involved to, raise these trees on this amazing structure? And more importantly, maybe the more general question would be, what is the impact of such a project on the city, on the lives of the inhabitants, on the ecology or the ecosystem of New York City? So I think it suggests all kinds of things, and I'm wondering whether it actually lives up to that. So maybe my presentation will revolve around some of these questions, looking at particular projects around the world, starting from Amsterdam, where I'm currently based. So let's maybe start also with the title. What's wrong with concrete trees? Yeah, good question. So obviously it relates to the image I just showed you, but it also was inspired by an article from the 70s from a person called Martin H. Krieger. I came across it a few years ago, and ever since I've been puzzled by it because it raises questions that I don't even have started answering. So what he's trying to show us is that we've reached a point now on this planet where landscapes are affected by humans to such an extent that nature as such doesn't exist anymore. Obviously, by now we all know this. There is the Anthropocene. I think by now we're all familiar with this conclusion, but I think it was quite provocative back in '73, which was just 1 year after the Club of Rome published the limits to growth, the famous report that states that we've reached the limits of what the world can handle in terms of resources. So 1 year later, he's actually proposing to accept the fact that we've screwed up and to accept the fact that everything to an extent is man-made and to start from there. So what's wrong with plastic trees? His conclusion is, my guess is that there is very little wrong with them. Much more can be done with plastic trees, and I like to give most people the feeling that they are experiencing nature. We will have to realize that the way in which we experience nature is conditioned by our society, which more and more is seen to be receptive to responsible interventions. So maybe you can just let this sink in. But what I take from this is that he's suggesting that we should accept the world that we've created. We should accept that nature as such in its pristine state no longer exists. So everything to an extent is a manufactured landscape. And starting from this idea, we can start thinking about what is value and what does ecology still, what kind of role does ecology still plays in these man-made environments. So I'm taking his question and slightly reformulating it and asking the question, what's wrong with concrete trees 50 years later? Starting from this place, but there are many more. Some of them I've collected on an Instagram, which Kaya was referring to, which is called Archipocene, which is obviously a combination of architecture and the Anthropocene. And there, this is really an ongoing exploration where I try to look around me, things that get my attention. I try to document them, try to reflect on them, and all of them have to do with how architecture is reshaping our world and the impact it has on the environment. So here you see a few examples. I will go deeper into them in a minute. And have a look on the Instagram itself. And maybe also nice to give a bit of a history. I think we're all familiar with this, but the destruction of the planet didn't start yet last year. It started, well, depending on how you look at things, maybe with colonialism and the pillaging of whole parts of the planet. And here, for example, I show an example of Brazil, where vast parts of the rainforest were cut already in the 16th century, not to use the wood to build structures, but to turn it into charcoal, to heat ovens that would melt iron ore to produce the steel that was necessary to construct buildings. So just to give an example of the complex relationship between our exploitative behavior and the built environment. Another example, Chicago being the main hub in Northern America for the trade in lumber and timber, sorry. I mean, I can talk for hours about just this one image, but you can probably get a sense of what this represents. An amazing book I came across, Manahata, which shows what New York used to look like before the Dutch, actually, the first colonial power who set foot on what was then called Manahata, what it looked like compared to the current situation. So you see the two kind of juxtapose here, New York in its current state on the left side, and then in its pristine state, let's say, around 1600 on the right-hand side. And it makes me wonder what happened. Or this example from Japan, where there's this ritual every 20 years, they're rebuilding the Ise shrine in the same city that has the same name, rebuilding a temple for which they have planted a whole forest. And these are holy trees, and they're cut in a very beautiful ritual every 20 years, and then they're brought by the whole community to the site where the temple is being reconstructed while the previous one is being dismantled. So again, thinking about the use of resources and how we deal with our environment. And maybe one of the last posts that you will find there is showing this amazing photo, which is a still from an equally amazing documentary called Taming the Garden by Salome Yoshi. And I hope some of you have had a chance to see it, but it shows basically the creation of a park in Georgia on the private estate of a very wealthy businessman, and also the former prime minister of Georgia, actually, who has been scouting for trees all across Georgia and has been buying them and has been shipping them to his private estate to create this incredible park there. So he literally put trees on ships to create his park. And this all against the background, the backdrop of this graph. So this shows the global tree cover up till 2015, but I can guarantee you the line is continuing downwards. So thinking about concrete trees versus, let's say, real trees, it's a sad sight. While the concrete trees are on the rise, the actual trees are being reduced by around 5 billion a year at this point in time. So again, going back to this place, what's wrong with concrete trees? Let's dig a bit deeper into that question. I try to do it through, reading through scientific papers, trying to understand the carbon emissions produced by some of these sites that I'm going to show you. Thinking of the ability of trees to actually capture CO2 from the air. So trying to see how all these things connect. And I could have gone into the direction where I would have bombarded you with all kinds of statistics, and not only would that have made us very depressed, I think it would also be not correct, because my main conclusion is actually that at this point there is no clear understanding of the ecological impact of these projects. And there's a wide variety of answers to some of the basic questions. So I think this presentation is also a plea to start asking certain questions, and maybe as researchers we can unite and start giving some answers to them, because I think it's really easy to, on the surface, be critical of such a project in New York or some others that I'm going to show now. But if you would start looking at the actual facts, it becomes more complicated by the minute. So to do everything justice, I think it's good to conduct proper research. But for now, for lack of real hard facts, I'm just going to share some observations starting in Amsterdam, where, as I said, where I live, starting with my own home, just to give you an example of the rather complex or problematic relationship between trees and humans. So this is my house. I live on the top floor. There's a fantastic monumental tree just in front of our house. And just a few weeks ago, we had the biggest storm since, I think, the Second World War, which knocked down this other amazing tree, which actually hit our roof. Here you see the roof. This is actually the window where I'm currently sitting behind. So imagine such a tree falling on your roof. We were shocked for many reasons, because the building was damaged, but also these fantastic trees that are so characteristic for the neighborhood were literally falling down as a result, directly or indirectly, of climate change. And not only did this one tree fall down, eventually they were taking down all 3 of the monumental trees around our building, because they might fall down and they might damage more buildings. So in prioritizing things, they put humans above the trees in a quite clear and destructive way. So here you see the result. They were lying there as bodies on the pavement, and it was just a very sad scene. Around the same time, this was delivered on my doorstep, a magazine which gives you an overview of all the things that are happening in Amsterdam. And on the cover, it has this incredible building, which is about to be finished. It's called the Valley. It's designed by MVRDV, and it's a variation on a vertical forest, let's say. We've seen it emerging from the skyline, and already back in 2016, my dear colleague and friend Mark Minkjan already dedicated an article on field architecture, another initiative I'm involved in, looking at the renders of this building, trying to understand what is this image promising in terms of ecological value that it would add to the city. And he already predicted that it would be very little, the value, because the way the trees are portrayed on this render is not very realistic given the climate and given the altitude, because some of these towers are 100 meters tall in the climate that you probably know from Amsterdam. So he was already critical, but now we are fast forward 6 years later. So let's go take a look at this building and see what it actually is. So this is again the render. This is another render. As I said, it's easy to be very judgmental of these places on first sight, but I think it's good to go beyond it. What this shows is, again, not a very realistic scene, I would say, but it's also the suggestion that the building will be partly public. So there will be on the 3rd and 4th and 5th floor, if I'm correct, there's a park-like landscape that is open to the public. So it's in the middle of the central business district of Amsterdam, which is very mineral. So I think in itself, it's a nice gesture to create some sort of small park environment there. So that's all good. But I mean, that is just to compensate for the fact that it's mostly very luxurious apartments that also will get the trees, but that will not be accessible, of course. It will only be enjoyed by the very few who can actually afford to live there. So if you look at this section here, it also becomes clear that compared to, for example, Bosco Verticale, which Stefano Boeri probably introduced in the opening lecture of this series, this one is not so much about wrapping the building in trees. It's about what's in the name, creating a valley. So the trees are all concentrated in the core of the building, but the facade itself is still, well, very typical for a central business district kind of environment, I would say, even though the shape obviously is very playful. But let's say it's too soon to say whether this is what this is, let's say, as an environment, as an actual place that you can visit where people will start to live, that will have all kinds of public amenities. So this is Piet Oudolf, the famous landscape architect, who is, suggesting or pretending to be planting the things himself. I think that's not very likely. But let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Let's see what this didn't even open yet, even though some of the people already moved into their apartments. But I think it's good to be critical of it. Let's go to Singapore, because in the same magazine that I showed you, which had this building, the previous one, the Valley, on the cover, it gave a glimpse of the future that Amsterdam should aspire to. So it was looking at other cities and how they're reintroducing green and ecology and trees and whatnot in the city. And they picked, of all cities, Singapore as an example for Amsterdam. I mean, apart from the huge difference in climate and the political system and everything else, I think, well, I'm going to show you an example of a project, and I would wonder, why would we want to have such a park in Amsterdam? But let me show it to you. Again, maybe I'm not in a position to say anything about this. I don't know the exact details of it, but I've been reading around it. I've been talking to people. So again, this is an impression I have, but I think there is good reason, again, to be rather critical of it, also given the promise of this project. So these are super trees. There are, I think, 18 of them. Some of them are as tall as 50 meters, and they're basically concrete towers with plants wrapped around them. And on the top, you would find solar panels. They harvest rainwater, so they serve multiple functions. So to an extent, they are trying to do good. But how on earth can this compensate for the incredible CO2 emissions, extraction of resources that were necessary in order to even start building these things? So here you see it from the sky. Interestingly enough, if you go to TripAdvisor, it gets a very high rating, a lot of reviews, which is also super interesting. If you look at the keywords that people are using, so they really use plants, flowers, waterfall, like natural elements, but there's also air conditioned. So it's really this synthetic environment that was referred to in the article with the title, "What's Wrong with Plastic Trees?" Well, clearly, most people here don't think there's anything wrong with plastic or concrete trees, except for this one grumpy person who could have been me, but it wasn't, who gave it just 1 out of 5 and has this whole rant. And I think some of these questions are very pertinent and very fair to ask. So what is the purpose? What were they thinking? What should we be thinking? Where are the gardens? Just a few miles away, there's the airport, just to show you that this is not an exception in the context of Singapore, but inside you will find this environment. Yeah, it's definitely spectacular, but interestingly enough, in both cases, it was a forest ecologist who is now the CEO of these projects. So there's actual knowledge being brought in. But to me, it just doesn't add up. Also, given the fact that Singapore, I mean, together with many other countries, including my own, but not in our country, but through extraction elsewhere, is reducing its forest at light speed. So you can build artificial trees, but not maybe if simultaneously you're actually taking down actual trees. So New York City, let's go to this park with which I started the presentation, which is called Little Island, as I said before, and it's designed by Hedderwick Studio together with MNLA landscape architects, with Arup, the engineers, and it was finished just recently. And so what is it? It's 132 pod-shaped structures that sit on 280 concrete pylons or pilings. And on top of that, you will find 114 trees that represent around 35 different species of trees. And in addition to that, there are all kinds of other species, insects, etc., of course. So again, I think on paper, and that's also why wealthy patrons bought into it, it adds some, let's say, nature to the city. But really as an add-on. I mean, there are already trees that are suffering right now in New York. So instead of, focusing on them or reactivating some of the parks, some wealthy patron decided to create an artificial island just off the coast, which got a lot of attention. But these images were very rarely shown. This is the construction of it, which looks like any other construction site, except for the shape. And then you will find some trees hidden there. And maybe also nice, also not something that is shared very widely, but I found out where the trees are actually coming from. So there are 3 nurseries scattered across the United States. This is how they were actually, like, one by one, they were brought to the little island. And again, I think this is too easy what I'm going to do, but I'm just going to say, just to provoke some discussion, see what you think of it. But I did some calculations, and just the transportation of one of these trees on such a truck to offset the CO2 emissions that are the cause of that, you would need 3 trees. So to transport 1 tree, you actually need 3 trees for a whole year to absorb the same CO2 from the air. Well, this is what it looks like. Maybe some of you have been there. Maybe you can weigh in when there's a chance to discuss it. At the same time, this is Central Park, just a few blocks away from it, where you have an actual natural landscape, which was largely destroyed because of everything else you see on the skyline. Yeah, I just couldn't avoid this one because he was one of the guests in this series, Stefano Boeri, who I also happen to have met before, and I know him really as a critical mind. I know he has good intentions, and I think he's great at spreading the gospel of rewilding or bringing green back into the city. So kudos for that. But let me just look at some of his projects and maybe try to raise some questions that certain websites forgot to do when they copied the press release. So I think most of you know this project. Just a quick summary. So it's in Milan. It's called Bosco Verticale, or vertical forest. So it's 2 towers. One is 112, the other is 80 meters tall, in the Porta Nova neighborhood of Milan. In total, there are 800 trees, 15,000 perennials, 5,000 shrubs. According to them, it's 30,000 square meters of woodland if you would spread it all like across the surface. And there are 1,600 specimens or species. I mean, I can immediately admit that it has a great visual effect, that it has, I mean, for sure, it adds value when you live there. It must be incredible to be walking out on your balcony and to be confronted with these beautiful trees around you, the smell of it. They cool down the building. They help to capture the rainwater. They attract insects. So indeed, I think it's incredible, especially compared to buildings that have a more mineral facade. So I can follow them when it comes to those qualities. But I think the fundamental flaw is that it's like all the calculations I see and how it contributes to the ecosystem, what is not taken into account is the embodied energy of, you know, producing all the concrete. So it needed extra planters. They are double reinforced to capture or to carry the weight of the trees. If you start, I just started calculating some of it, and luckily some other people also did some work in that field. So maybe just one number. In another case, it has a similar balcony system also with trees. Just for one of these planters, so one of these balconies that holds a tree, you would need, for that tree should absorb CO2 for 155 years just to compensate for the CO2 emission as a result of this one single piece of concrete that holds the tree. I'm not saying that Stefano Boeri is not admitting that there are these externalities that come with the building, but I think the people he sells them to are blinded by it, and they just don't take that into account. And I think we really should and could do better, and should take a next step in becoming critical, learn from this. I know that he's now looking into timber as a building material. He's just realized a social housing block using the same vertical forest concept. So I think that those are all great steps, but the more fundamental issue also needs to be tackled, would be my proposal. Because this is, if you would look behind this green veneer, this is what you would find. It's basically, yeah, a big pile of concrete. This is from a very interesting documentary that they produced themselves, where the construction company is actually admitting that they had to bring lots of extra concrete in order to carry the weight of the trees. This is, by the way, the affordable housing project in Eindhoven in the Netherlands. So again, these apartments are maybe 600, 700 euros a month. It's amazing that they managed to do this, to bring so much quality to such a building. So I think in that sense, it's a fantastic step, but in terms of ecological impact, I'm not so sure. So to quote Philip Oldfield, who just wrote another critical piece on the zine about another project by Hedderwick, we must do better than 1,000 trees. Kaya, can you tell me how I'm doing time-wise?
You're fine. We still have about 25 minutes.
Okay, let's not only be critical and bash things that I wasn't involved in, so I don't carry the responsibility. I know how difficult it is to, live up to your promise, to get the support from everyone involved. So I think, for example, Stephen Oweri is fantastic in really learning his lessons, trying to push this idea. But again, I mean, if you look at his portfolio, how he's like predicting the future of the city to look like, I think I don't know, I'm not sure whether this is very realistic and if we should even consider this, to be honest. So I think things are going a bit out of control. I'm not gonna linger too long on this. You can look it up on their website, and I'm just curious, like, what do you make of this? Is this or for example, the Grenfell Tower, I think we were all devastated when we learned about the fire that burned down this building and killed, I don't know how many, but maybe 200 people. And the proposal now is to turn it yet again into a vertical forest as some sort of way to commemorate the people who live there. I'm just really puzzled when I hear to me, this really makes no sense given the tragedy that happened there. So I think it's better to focus maybe on someone else, cherishing the core of the concept, namely to reintroduce nature in the city. But I think it could or should be done differently. And not like this, another project of Bueri in an airport. I mean, you cannot greenwash airports while you're simultaneously pretending to build vertical forests. I just don't, for me, that just doesn't add up. So what to do? What could we do? Is this the future then? Should we move away from cities? This is something I found, and there are many examples of it. All kinds of universities all around the world have been experimenting with artificial trees that you could put out there in the desert. They would suck up all the CO2, so we don't have to be bothered by it in the cities. So maybe that's an answer. This is like a recent reiteration of the same thing. These things are actually being built as we speak, courtesy of the Arizona State University. Yeah, maybe some of you are working on these kinds of geoengineering projects. I'd be curious to hear from you. Or should we, this is the documentary I referred to in the beginning, where the rich businessman, former Prime Minister of Georgia, started moving entire trees to his estate as a way to protect them. Is that the way forward? Should we start treating trees as artifacts and bring them to museums in a way? So just some stills from this documentary, because I think it's incredible what is happening in the world right now. Like at the same time, we're building shopping malls, airports filled with rainforest, and we're moving entire trees across the country to build someone's private park. It's just, sometimes it's a bit too much for me to handle. So this is the park actually. So these are the trees and how they're brought together. So I just want to, I'm now working towards the end. I just want to quote Agnes Dennis, who said that planting trees is not the same as replacing a forest. And maybe to illustrate that, well, I think some or most of you know this work, this field that she created just beyond or besides the World Trade Center that was being constructed. But more recently, she created this forest on a former mine in Finland, where she understood it's one thing to add a piece of nature in the city, it's another thing to start restoring the devastation that happened as a result of human interference outside of our city. So she shifted her attention away from the city and is now more concerned with reforestation projects. And I think this is, for me, this is really inspiring. And luckily, Stefano Boeri, I keep coming back to him, he's also spearheading another project that is in the same spirit in Milan called Forestami, or Forestami, which is the plan to add one tree for each inhabitant of Milan. So to add 3 million more trees to Milan, to the region of Milan, until 2013. And I think this is the kind of movement that we should all embrace and should start contributing to while staying critical. I just want to, one final thing I want to share with you is a book that I worked on with some people over the years that was published 2 years ago, which is called Rewriting Architecture, but the subtitle is more important. It's Tabula Scripta. So maybe you know Tabula Rasa, this idea of the clean slate to start from scratch, like the modernist dream of like pristine land, you can do whatever you want. And this is an attempt or a plea to reconsider this myth and to instead start thinking of the tabula scripta, so the written slate, to start from what's there, to contribute to what's already existing in cities, to add value and not extract value. So it's a collection of examples of a different way of dealing with the existing built environment. And some of them are actually dealing directly also with trees, including a project that you could be very critical of, as you might know by now, such as the High Line in New York, which just adds this very thin layer of, well, some sort of ecosystem to an abandoned industrial heritage site. But it also uses metaphors or processes from nature, such as crafting, to rethink how we deal with what exists. But it also shows real examples of architects, like some of you, maybe some of you were involved. This is a project in Mexico by Rosana Montiel, where she actually preserved the trees that were already in the courtyard, and she kind of built the public space around it. Or this example of La Caton Fassal, where they kept the trees and they just wrapped the villa around it. So it's both private and public. It's this example of the Japanese shrine that I already mentioned. But it's also a celebration of the fact that we can actually coexist with trees and other non-human living entities, such as this amazing example from Ahmedabad, this time, by Ivan Baan, a photo. And the final one, one that I visited myself, this is Pruitt-Igoe, the famous or notorious modernist housing complex in St. Louis in the United States that was built in the 50s and then torn down in the 70s. And if you would go there now, parts of it have been given back to nature or taken over by nature. So there's an actual forest there where there used to be a place where people were living. So this is just to say that no matter what we do, at one point, nature will strike back. And with that, I would like to end and would like to hear from some of you, your thoughts or questions, whether you agree, disagree, or any other remark.
Thank you so much, Michiel. That was super fascinating, and it was great to kind of to hear your pointed and kind of critical approach to so much of what we are seeing in relation to ecological design, especially in relation to this contest that we're running. I guess I'll start first, and I would highly recommend that our students at IAAC, and especially those of you in the advanced ecological master's program to ask some questions to Michiel. But it seems to me that a lot of what we see within kind of architects' visions of the future are these ecological models which take such a positivist approach. So I guess my question is like, why do architects always seem, to be so naive to the jaw-dropping facts of being confronted with the fact that we're in the Anthropocene, or what some would call the Anthropocene? And it almost seems to me that like if architects feel as if they don't solve the problem, that no one will. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about that.
I don't think they're naive. I mean, I'm not an architect, disclaimer, but I talk to many architects and I know they're fully aware of everything you mentioned just now. I think it's just an inability or an unwillingness or a combination of these two that prevents them from speaking out and addressing these issues. And instead what they do is they try to smuggle some thin layer of it into their project, which gives this impression that what the project does is actually contributing to a better world and a better environment. But we all know, if you start taking into account the whole picture from beginning to end, or even acknowledging there is no end, the project doesn't end when you give the key to the owner. That's when it actually starts or restarts, and some buildings outlive us. So I think the responsibility should also stretch into the future. But if you start doing that, I mean, this is something I'm really grappling with. You might want to stop your profession, or you might want to change careers, because I don't see. I was looking at your website, so I'm really intrigued by like the material experiments you're doing. I think this is the only way out of this mess, acknowledging that there are 8 billion people on the planet. They all need to be housed, so we cannot shy away from providing them with shelter and housing. But to do it with concrete in the way that Stefano Boeri, for example, or this park, to add a park and to add quality to a city while you're at the same time, doing so much damage on another level. So I think it's not naivety. I think it's also the market, I guess. They've fallen victim to the market, and I think it's really hard. But maybe there are some architects listening now who have found a way out, or who dare to speak up. And when a project developer demands that they repeat the same Photoshop over and over again.
Right. No, yeah, and I guess your background is kind of more of an urbanist, and even focused on some heritage aspects as well. Kind of gives you this unique perspective to that issue.
But let me be clear: I really encourage people to think beyond what I've said and to not be, held back by my cynicism. And but what I mean, you also visit places, and when you look around you, if you see the projects that get awarded, I mean, if you would assess it with the facts that we all know, I don't think they deserve these awards. I think they deserve attention because you can learn from them, and it's really hard to shift overnight away from this addiction to concrete and all these extractive processes. But you have to continue to take steps. You cannot, get stuck for too long in like a new version of what turns out to be the same old, in a way.
Yes, and I think the point that you bring up about the fact that these kind of apartments in Milan being available to people who maybe wouldn't have been able to access that kind of housing otherwise is kind of a good way to kind of see it in a positive light of giving access to that kind of almost what we would consider a luxurious experience of housing.
Yeah, no, I mean, in the States, there's this concept of food deserts, but there's also actual deserts, like cities that are endless, where there's no access to green space for the vast majority of the people. So from that perspective, I would only strongly encourage more of these kinds of projects, but not with the false promise of not further damaging the planet, because that's not true.
Right, because essentially then I mean, you refer to that as kind of greenwashing, right? It's like saying that you're solving problems that maybe you're not even able to tackle with the project itself.
Yeah, and maybe you could, like with the Bosco Vertical, for example, if there would have been some sort of dashboard on the facade that would have stated like, this was an attempt. We've gained so much from this project, but there's still so much to go, right? So we've reduced CO2 emissions by an X percentage, which is a great achievement, but it's still far removed from where we need to go. Then I think it could really be read as an encouragement. So this is one step. Who's next to take the next step? But now it's seen as like the holy grail. Let's all build vertical forests all around the world and make entire cities out of it, which doesn't make a lot of sense, I guess.
Yeah, this radical act of like being transparent about that, I think could be very enlightening for many. We do have a question in the chat, actually.
Yeah. It's a really interesting one.
Oscar asks, I was wondering whether you think timber construction could still be sustainable when it will take over on a global scale.
I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but I did look into the history of resource extraction, and remember the image that I showed you of this huge pile of tree trunks in Chicago 100 years ago. Back then, most of the houses were built from wood. So in a way, it's also, I think, history repeating itself, where we're now, I mean, concrete has been around for 5,000 years, but the scale at which we were using it was just maybe for 100 years or 150 years. So now we're moving away, but we're also kind of moving back to something that we already knew, and look at the devastation to the environment that happened back then. So I think it's a good question. And I think it's also something to keep in mind, especially knowing that trees, it takes a while for them to grow into mature trees, right? So before you can actually start using them, it takes years and years and years. So yeah, I don't know. I think it will. I don't think it's gonna. I think it's a good intermediate material probably. But at the end of the day, I think, like within your school, the kinds of materials you're also looking into, I think that's really the future.
Yeah.
But maybe someone in the audience has a more convincing answer to that question.
Yes, if anyone has a question, feel free to put your name in the chat and we can continue with the list. But yes, I heard about this. There was a conversation, an argument basically saying that, you know, the revolution in steel and concrete took, what was it, 30 years. And so like considering that maybe the timber revolution would take the same amount of time. And I think the timber, like, of course we can change the industry, but at the same time, because trees are dependent upon a particular kind of period of time to grow, we can't really rush that process. And so in addition to having to revolutionize the industry, we also have to basically revolutionize the way in which we manage forests as well. And that's like that's a kind of generational question as well.
But I mean, just the fact that trees don't grow everywhere, right? So if it becomes the default material, but you still have to ship it from across the other end of the world, if you then again take this more holistic view, maybe the wood in itself, how it functions as a building material, is better than concrete, for sure. But if the concrete can be produced locally and the tree has to be brought in from, I don't know, Canada, I'm not sure if that would all add up. So I think it's again more complicated. So things that can, same with energy, renewable energy, you can put it out on the ocean, or you can, you know, have solar panels on your roof. Like it matters where you produce the things, where you harvest the things, where you get your resources from. So the same goes for the use of timber, I guess.
Yes. I have the coordinator of the Master in Advanced Ecological Buildings and BioCities next to me, and he has a question for you. So I'll pass the computer over to him.
I had written an article or two for Failed Architecture previously, so it's super nice.
Great.
You know, you hear in your presentation, and I think, you know, I encourage a lot of my students here also to be very critical and to hone in on sort of the marketing angle of sustainable design, because I think that's where you really see a lot of the seams and a lot of things starting to come loose with their claims. But I think, you know, for architects, it's like a lot of lessons of unlearning and a lot of things of being more confused about what we thought we knew about how the industry should exist. And it's kind of difficult to, you know, say that and said, okay, now you have to go, you know, into the professional world and actually build a building. Like that sort of productive confusion is somehow less tolerated in a, you know, staunchly important and sort of serious discipline like architecture. So I wonder if you think also that, you know, is that one sort of inhibitor to having a more serious discussion about the scale of climate change, is because, you know, architecture is sort of outside of this realm where experimentation is allowed to be more radical.
Yeah, in a way, the profession reproduces itself with each new generation. I am employed by a university, which is, I think, a good example of that, where a lot of the energy and resources go into making excellent architecture, which is oftentimes just, I know, an optimization of an existing archetype in a way. So it's I mean, there's a lot changing. I'm oversimplifying the situation, but I think it has this really strong and long tradition of doing things in a particular way. And I think even myself, you tend to reproduce things that seem to work, especially if it provides jobs to students. If you know that you're preparing them for a labor market that actually has an appetite for these skills. So it's really hard when you're also feeding the market to kind of step away and, you know, be radical and rethink. So I think for that, you really need mediators who can help pave the way in another direction. So in the Netherlands, we were lucky to have someone called Floris Alkema, with whom I also co-edited the book, but he was the state architect. He was also a partner at OMA with Rem Koolhaas. So he, like, for years, he's been doing the most hideous projects, and he's like, he admits that. But he's come to his senses, and I think during his term as the state architect, he really literally knocked on the doors of concrete manufacturers and other manufacturers of building materials, saying, your time is up. If you're not going to change, people are going to move on. They will find new materials. So either you move with it and you start experimenting and producing new types of materials, or even like new types of concrete for that matter, that are slightly more sustainable. Otherwise, you're going to lose out and you'll be out of business soon. So he really took, because he was independent, he was paid by the state, but he could really negotiate between the profession and the industry, saying, you know what, the time has come. We all have to do our bit, and it's also your turn to start moving. So I think it takes these independent roles, because architects are also just, most of them are entrepreneurs, and I don't blame them for that. I think a lot of great things also come out of it, and that spirit is something that is important, but it prevents you often from, you know, being really transgressive, which I think is necessary at this point. I don't know if that's an answer to your question.
That was great.
Yeah, I think that's a really good kind of way to kind of sum up all of this stuff, is that, you know, this is all surrounding the competition, you know, to the BioCities contest. And I think we're asking for like radical solutions in that sense. And I think that, you know, especially if we want to really face this issue that we've been kind of confronted with, we really have to rethink, you know, the way the disciplines work, and architecture being one of those. So it's like not just reproducing what it is that we've seen before, obviously understanding that we are influenced by those things, but wanting to do something more as well.
But I do think the little I know of what you're doing, that this is also crucial, like reintroducing materials, reintroducing crafts, or working with your hands, not only to learn the craft but also to really engage with the material world around you, to understand that things have their own rhythm and energy and their capabilities. So you should start relating to your environment through your senses. And I think that's really a smart thing compared to lots of other architecture schools where you sit behind your computer all day, where you really lose touch of what the world is all about, I guess.
Right, and this feeling that we should be IAAC's kind of phrase being learning by doing, so kind of hands-on approach, like you say, reevaluating those materials and reinventing them in some way. We have one more question, which I don't know if you have an answer to. Not being yourself.
The embodied carbon calculator.
Exactly, calculators. Anything that you had been experimenting with?
I mean, I've been going through science and all the academic journals just to get the numbers, and I've been putting them next to each other. And I know there are embodied carbon calculators, but depends on the input. So what data are they referring to when they actually do the calculation? So I would suggest to not use the calculators, but use the raw input numbers and start comparing them. So I've done some calculations just by hand, as I've done a lot more, where you in some journals they say this, and others they say that. What if you would compare those and apply them to your project? I think that is, again, I think these carbon calculator thing, it's just another expression of the same problem around greenwashing. So there is no easy solution to any of these things. So it's always way more complicated. So it's not you type in 100 times 33 and then you get an answer to the question. So I think it's really about being critical, trying to understand the sources of information and statistics, calling up scientists, asking them, what did you mean? I think it's really what we need now, this kind of more bold and critical engagement with these kinds of phenomenon. But another, maybe related to this question, I think it's also good to look on field architecture. Another contributor writes about embodied carbon from the perspective of the human energy that goes into projects. So to extend it beyond the material resources, but what if you start taking into account in some cases even slave labor, but let's say all the hard labor, the blood, sweat and tears of everyone down the chain that contributes to the realization of a project. And if you would add that to like the normal embodied carbon calculation, I think you again get a whole different understanding of what a project actually, what the impact of a project is from a more human perspective. So yeah, I didn't give an answer, I'm sorry, but I really encourage you to compare and be critical and maybe invent a new one that is more more subtle and more honest in a way.
That's a great answer.
And you can, if you need help, or let's do it together. I'm not saying it's your responsibility, but I think it's what we should all see as a responsibility.
I think that's all for questions in the chat, but yeah, it was, Lillian says amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Michiel, it was amazing to have you here and for you to join us for this, for celebrating this contest, and also, yeah, to kind of, I mean, it's great to kind of have Stefano Breri and then have someone who takes this critical approach, but doesn't completely destroy, you know, deconstruct the, I mean, just asks you to look at it a little bit harder. And I think that's exactly what we need for this kind of event. So thank you so much. And I hope that we can, you know, meet again. You're welcome to visit IAAC and see some of our facilities, see what we're doing here.
That would be great, yeah. Yeah, let's keep the conversation alive. And anyone who wants to contact me, I think I shared, you know, send me a message on Instagram. That's actually how we got to know each other. So that works best for me. Looking forward to having more of these kinds of conversations.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you
We're going to have another lecture soon, so stay in touch.
Okay. Bye-bye, everyone. Have a good evening.
You too.
Thank you so much. That was great. I really love that.
Thank you.